Prescott Valley isn't the kind of place where things go viral. Out here, you fix fences, swap eggs for gas money, and keep to yourself. That's how I liked it. Quiet, sun-bleached, and slow. But everything changed the day Brenda disappeared and left 7 newborn kittens behind in the trailer next door. I found them by accident, stuffed in a moldy cardboard box under a broken window, barely alive, no mother in sight. What made it even stranger was the falcon, Leena. She'd been nesting near the radio tower behind the lot for months, but that day, she swooped down and landed beside the kittens. Didn't try to hurt them, just stood there, watched them, guarded them. I don't know why I let it happen, but I didn't chase her off. That decision lit a fuse I didn't see coming, and by the time the media showed up, it was already too late to go back. I still remember the exact feel of that morning. Dry heat already gathering in the rust-colored sand, cicadas winding up their chorus in the brittle mesquite trees, and the low hum of something not quite right hanging over the yard like static. The trailer Brenda had rented stood silent, its windows fogged with grime, its steps sagging like a held-in breath finally giving out. I was doing a quick walk around to check a busted water line she'd complained about weeks ago, back when she was still answering her phone and flinging cigarette butts into the driveway. But she was gone now, left the place stripped of anything worth pawning and heavy with a smell I'd come to recognize from wildlife calls: neglect. It wasn't until I slid the side door open that the real weight of it hit me. The smell wasn't mold. It was milk, old blood, and the faint, warm stink of desperation. In a soggy cardboard box shoved beneath a crooked shelf, I found them. 7 tiny kittens, eyes barely open, bellies sunken in like deflated balloons, their fur matted with dried formula and bits of insulation. One of them, the smallest, wasn't moving, but the others were crying. Thin, reedy sounds like air leaking out of torn lungs. I crouched there, frozen for longer than I should have been, heart hammering in my throat as my brain tried to stitch together the timeline. How long had they been alone? Days, at least. There was no sign of a mother cat, just a tipped-over can of generic formula powder and a cracked feeding bottle lying nearby like an abandoned promise. I reached in with both hands and cradled as many as I could against my chest, whispering something I couldn't even hear over the thrum in my ears, my hands moving faster now, wrapping them in a flannel shirt I'd left in my truck. But what stopped me cold was the sound outside, sharp, cutting through the stillness. A falcon's cry. I turned and saw her, Leena, perched on the low fence just outside the door, her head cocked, wings twitching ever so slightly, eyes locked on mine. She was a local oddity, known to a few birdwatchers in the area, but I'd never seen her act like this. She didn't move when I stepped out, kittens swaddled in my arms. She didn't flinch or spook when I passed her. She followed me, not flying, but hopping along the fence line, keeping pace until I reached my porch. It was eerie, like she was watching over them, or worse, expecting me to do something. I laid the kittens down in a crate padded with towels, set them beneath the shade, and turned to look at her. She was still there, her chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm, gaze unbroken. I couldn't explain it then, but something in her presence stilled the panic in me. Maybe it was the silence between her cries, or maybe it was the way she stayed rooted to that fence like a sentry. Either way, I knew this was no ordinary rescue. Something strange had taken root here, and I could already feel it growing under my skin. The first night was long, not because the kittens were loud, most of them were too weak to cry for long, but because every tiny movement from their box felt like an alarm going off in my head. I hadn't bottle-fed anything this small in over a year, not since I helped a litter of raccoons that were orphaned during a flash flood near Skull Canyon. But this was different. These weren't wild animals misplaced by nature. They were dumped, discarded like torn clothes, and the weight of that truth made my hands tremble as I mixed formula in the flickering light of my kitchen. I had them set up in an old dog crate, lined with layers of towels warmed in the dryer, a space heater humming nearby. One by one I fed them Pumpkin, who latched on immediately with an urgent hunger, Luna, whose cloudy eyes followed every sound, and Bean, who hissed weakly at my hand before giving in. The smallest one, Midge, struggled to swallow and made me hold my breath with every drop she took. I stayed there all night, hunched on the floor, whispering to them like I was trying to convince them life was worth sticking around for. When morning came, I stumbled outside for air, and there she was again, Leena, perched in the same spot on the fence like she hadn't moved. Her feathers were slick with morning dew, but she stood tall, eyes fixed on the window where the crate sat. I walked past her and felt it again, that uncanny stillness. Wild birds don't linger. They come, they strike, they vanish into the sky. But Leena had settled into something else, something almost maternal, if I could stomach using that word. I didn't tell anyone at first. Who'd believe it anyway? A falcon watching over kittens? It sounded like a bad children's book or a joke told over cheap beers. But that morning, when Marla from 2 trailers over came to drop off some eggs and spotted Leena pacing the railing, she froze mid-step. "That bird's guarding something," she said, half to herself. "You mark my words, she's choosing." Choosing what, she didn't say, but her eyes lingered on the window with an odd kind of reverence, like she saw something more sacred than strange. By the second day, I was getting texts from Officer Marino, Animal Control, asking why Brenda's place was flagged for a wellness check. I told him I'd handle it, but I knew that wouldn't last. The kittens needed vetting, meds, and a plan. I wasn't a rescue, just a guy with some know-how and a heart too soft for his own good. But even then, as I watched them twitch in their sleep, tiny paws curling like question marks in the fleece, I knew I wasn't ready to let them go. And then there was the matter of Leena. She hadn't left. She took to roosting above the crate at night, wings flared if anything got too close, like she had declared this patch of yard hers to defend. It made me wonder, were they her chosen flock now? Or was I? By the third night, Midge had stopped eating. Her tiny ribs pushed against her skin like a birdcage, and she no longer responded when I stroked her back with a warm fingertip. I'd been using a syringe to feed her every 2 hours, crouched like a supplicant beside the crate, but now even that effort was met with silence. Her body was too tired, too empty, and I felt something primal begin to unravel in me. I'd lost animals before. Hawks, foxes, even a fawn that didn't survive the transport, but this was different. This was intimate. I had named her, watched her sleep in the crook of my hand, and just before dawn she died there, between one breath and the next. No sound, no struggle, just the slow stilling of something unbearably small and alive. I buried her at the edge of the property, beneath the fence where Leena always perched. She was watching me again, but this time she didn't seem still. She looked restless, wings twitching, talons clicking softly against the old wood post. I dug the grave with my hands because it felt wrong to use a shovel. The dirt was dry and cracked, and every handful I pulled loose scraped my fingers raw. I laid Midge in a little shoebox lined with the corner of my old hoodie, and when I covered her, I whispered an apology that tasted like metal in my mouth. I don't know if it was the silence or the way the early light hit Leena's feathers, but for a brief moment, I felt like she was mourning too. That same morning, Marla showed up uninvited, holding a manila folder against her chest like it was something fragile. She told me to sit, which I didn't, and then she handed it over without speaking. Inside were grainy printouts, screenshots from a local Facebook group, my name, photos of my yard, the kittens, the falcon, comments piled beneath each one, some full of wonder, others soaked in outrage. Why hasn't Animal Control stepped in? This guy's using wild animals to babysit kittens. This isn't a Disney movie. It's dangerous. The pictures had clearly been taken from a distance, probably by someone driving past or watching from a neighbor's window. Someone had seen Leena perched above the crate and turned it into a spectacle. I felt my stomach turn, not from the attention, but from the distortions. No one asked what I was doing, how hard I'd tried, how much sleep I'd lost. They just saw something weird and filled in the blanks with whatever made them feel righteous or clever. Moreno called that afternoon, said he'd received several concerned messages, said we might have a situation. I hung up on him. I shouldn't have, but I did. That night, Leena didn't roost. I looked for her in the tower, the fence line, the trees behind the lot. Nothing, just shadows and wind. And for the first time since this started, the silence didn't feel protective. It felt like something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. The morning after Leena vanished, the sky felt heavier, not from weather, but from the sudden emptiness that pressed down on everything she had once touched. The fence looked wrong without her silhouette, the yard too still, too unguarded. I stood by the crate for longer than I should have, watching the kittens squirm restlessly in their sleep, their tiny bodies seeking warmth and structure in each other, like survivors clinging to wreckage. Midge's absence echoed louder than her tiny cries ever had, and now that Leena was gone, it felt like I'd lost both centuries in one breath. Grief, I've learned, doesn't need size to weigh you down. Sometimes it's the smallest things that drag the hardest. Marla showed up again that afternoon, this time without knocking, holding a tray of boiled chicken, goat's milk, and a stack of printed emails. She was quiet at first, hovering by the doorway, but when she spoke, her voice was tight and deliberate. "You need to call the shelter," she said, not cruelly, but with that sharp-edged softness people use when they think they're helping. I shook my head without looking at her, spooning a few drops of warm formula onto a paper towel and letting Pumpkin lap it up. Marla sighed, long, low, and full of that older woman exhaustion that comes from seeing too many good things unravel. "They need more than one man with a space heater and a bird that's gone AWOL," she said. I didn't reply. I couldn't, not because she was wrong, but because I was afraid she was right. Moreno called again. This time he didn't bother with the small talk. "You've got to bring them in," he said. "There's heat advisories, and frankly, this has gone public. People are calling Channel 12. Dylan, they're saying you're staging some kind of freak show." I wanted to yell, to remind him I'd saved these kittens, that I'd buried one with my own hands, that I'd watched a wild falcon stand guard over them like it was the most natural thing in the world. But none of that mattered to Moreno. He spoke in reports, liabilities, containment. "You've got 48 hours, he said. "Then I have to file." That evening, I sat outside with the crate at my feet, watching the horizon, hoping to see that familiar flash of wings, that silver-gray blur against the dusk. Nothing came. Only the wind. Only the long, pink bleeding of sunset across the scrubland. Inside the crate, Luna purred for the first time, soft and barely there, as if she was trying to remind me that something small could still go forward. I don't know what changed in me right then, but I felt something settle. Not peace, never that, but a kind of grit, raw and honest. These kittens didn't ask to be found. They didn't choose me, but they were here, and until someone forced my hand, they would stay. Shelter or no shelter, falcon or no falcon. I wasn't done yet. The next challenge didn't arrive with a knock or a phone call. It came on 4 wheels and a loud engine, kicking up dust that curled around my yard like smoke. A rusted white van with no plates pulled up just before noon, parking half on the gravel, half in the mesquite. 2 people stepped out, young, maybe late 20s, dressed in matching t-shirts with the words Desert Paw Network printed across the front in faded blue letters. I recognized the name vaguely from online, one of those grassroots rescues that sprang up during the pandemic, all enthusiasm and GoFundMe campaigns, most of them working out of backyards and Facebook pages. The woman, a tall redhead with a clipboard, introduced herself as Carly and wasted no time explaining that they'd been tagged repeatedly in photos from the area and had come to assist. I didn't know whether to be grateful or irritated. She wasn't rude, but her tone had that overly polite, curated edge that made everything she said feel rehearsed, like she'd said it 100 times before and expected me to just nod and comply. The man with her, Jonas, she said, hovered silently behind her shoulder, his arms crossed and his eyes scanning the yard like he was assessing damage. Carly asked to see the kittens. I said no. She asked again, softer this time, trying to smile past the refusal. "We just want to make sure they're stable. We have vet contacts. We could take a few off your hands if that helps." I told her I'd consider it, but the words felt hollow even as I said them. That evening, I caught them photographing the property from across the street. Jonas had a long lens camera, and Carly was on her phone, talking loudly about neglect indicators and wildlife interference. I didn't confront them. What would have been the point? But a cold weight settled in my chest. This wasn't about the kittens anymore. It wasn't even about Leena. It was about narrative. Whoever told the best version of the story would win. And in the court of public opinion, A lone guy with a falcon and 7 mewling kittens didn't stand much of a chance against matching shirts and nonprofit hashtags. Inside, the kittens were finally showing signs of strength. Scratch had learned to climb over the fleece mound, and Echo had taken to batting at shadows with tiny, uncertain swipes. Their eyes were clearer, their coats glossier. They were, despite everything, surviving. But the air outside was turning sour. Neighbors I'd known for years had started avoiding eye contact. One even left an anonymous note in my mailbox that read, "Let the experts handle it before you kill more." As if Midge had died from incompetence and not hunger and abandonment. I sat out by the crate that night, every light off, just me and the kittens and the hum of the heater, waiting again for wings that wouldn't come. Something was shifting. I could feel it in my bones. The rescue had grown teeth, and now it was starting to bite back. The following morning broke with the sharp scent of creosote in the air, a sure sign a storm was gathering somewhere beyond the horizon, even if the clouds hadn't yet arrived. The kittens were growing, that much was certain. Leena now greeted me with a high-pitched trill every time I opened the crate. Pumpkin had taken to gnawing gently at my thumb after each feeding, and Echo, who had barely moved the first 2 days, was now trying to climb the towel-lined walls like he was built for mountains. But even as their strength returned, so did the question I'd been avoiding since the moment I carried them out of Brenda's mold-ridden trailer. Was I keeping them for them, or for me? Marla posed the question without meaning to. She stopped by with a travel crate she'd found at a yard sale, scrubbed clean and draped with an old curtain, and said, offhandedly, "They're starting to imprint on you, you know." I laughed it off at first, joking about how they probably thought I was a hairless, overworked mama cat. But later, while washing bottles in the sink, her words kept folding back in on themselves. I didn't want to admit it, but they were imprinted on me too. Not just their soft, milk-warm bodies or the tiny squeaks they made in their sleep, but what they represented. They were fragile things I could still protect. And in a world where so much was out of reach, Leena, the silence of Midge's absence, the opinions of strangers, these kittens were something I could actually hold on to. But Moreno wasn't letting up. He stopped by in person this time, sunglasses on, posture stiff like he was bracing for an argument before I'd even opened the door. "They need vaccinations," he said without preamble. "Proper care, a plan. You can't just keep them forever." I told him I was doing everything I could, and he didn't argue that. He could see the bottles, the lined crate, the records I was keeping like some kind of makeshift vet tech. But then he said something that lodged under my skin like a splinter. "If you're holding on because you can't let go, that's not rescue, Dylan. That's something else." I wanted to yell at him, ask if he'd ever spent 3 hours trying to get a half-starved kitten to nurse from a rubber tip, or buried something so tiny and still that your own breathing felt like a betrayal. But I didn't. I just stood there, jaw clenched, until he gave a small sigh and walked off without another word. That night, I sat on the porch with Leena tucked under my arm, her rhythmic purring vibrating faintly through my ribs, and I thought about what would happen if I let them go. If I handed them off to a shelter or a foster, would they be safe? Would they remember me? Would I still feel like I'd done the right thing? Or would I be just another person who abandoned them, only slower, only cleaner? The questions coiled tight in my chest, and the wind rose softly in the trees behind the lot, stirring the air like something unseen was listening. The storm finally arrived that night, not just a desert tease of wind and dust, but a real downpour, the kind that turns dry earth into slick clay and sends jackrabbits darting for shelter. Thunder cracked overhead like a snapped power line, and the sky lit up in violent bursts that painted the landscape in eerie blue-white pulses. I had the kittens inside now, the crate set up near the heater in my living room, towels layered thick and soft beneath them. But the sound of the rain drumming against the roof made them restless. Bean cried out first, a high, uncertain mew, and soon the others joined in, their little bodies squirming in the flickering shadows like they were trying to crawl their way out of the noise. I hushed them as best I could, rocking the crate gently like it was a cradle, whispering nonsense words just to hear my own voice over the sound of the storm. But even above the wind and rain, I heard it, the sharp, metallic clatter of something hitting the porch. I froze, breath caught in my throat, and moved toward the window, careful not to step too loud. Outside, barely visible in the slanted rain, was a figure hunched beneath the overhang. Not Marino, not Marla. It was Brenda. Her coat was soaked, hair plastered to her face, makeup streaked down her cheeks like a mask half melted. She looked like someone who hadn't slept in days, and when she raised her eyes to the window, I saw something wild and cornered there. Something I hadn't expected. Fear. I opened the door without a word, heart hammering in my chest, and she didn't step forward. Just stood there, hands shoved deep into her pockets, shoulders trembling from cold or nerves or both. "They're alive?" she asked, voice barely audible over the rain. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She looked past me into the house, toward the crate she couldn't quite see, and let out a breath that shuddered all the way through her. I left food. I didn't mean to." She broke off, swallowing the rest like it tasted bad even in her own mouth. I should have yelled. I should have demanded answers, thrown every accusation I'd been carrying for days straight into her face. But all I could do was stare. Because in that moment what struck me wasn't anger. It was how much smaller she looked, how hollow, like she was barely standing beneath all that regret. "You can't have them back," I said finally, my voice low but steady. She flinched, but didn't argue. She just nodded slowly, like she already knew. Then, without another word, she turned and vanished into the curtain of rain, swallowed up like she'd never been there at all. I stood on the porch long after she'd gone, soaked to the bone, listening for Leena's cry in the distance, but it never came. Just the steady, endless sound of water hitting earth, washing everything clean and still leaving behind the weight of what it couldn't erase. The days after Brenda's appearance settled into a strange, taut rhythm, like walking across a rope strung over something deep you couldn't quite see the bottom of. The rain had cooled the air for a few days, leaving behind that rare, clean scent that only happens in the desert after a storm, like the world itself had been hosed down and reminded to breathe. The kittens, now into their 6th day with me, were changing rapidly, sleeker, more alert, louder. Pumpkin had developed a habit of sitting on top of his siblings like a king surveying his kingdom, while Luna and Echo were constantly locked in soft, clumsy battle for the warmest spot under the fleece blanket. Even Bean, the last to trust me, had started to nuzzle my fingers when I reached into the crate. They were no longer just fragile things struggling to survive. They were individuals now, each of them blooming in their own imperfect, stubborn way. Marla kept coming by, sometimes with food, sometimes with information. She told me that the Facebook post had crossed state lines, that someone from a wildlife organization in New Mexico had reached out asking about Leena, wanting to know if we had tagged her or had any clear footage. "They think it's instinct," she said, voice soft but curious. "Some kind of imprinting anomaly, maybe maternal displacement." I just nodded, but I hated how clinical it sounded. Leena had been more than instinct. Whatever it was that had passed between her and those kittens, it hadn't been just biology. It had been something rarer, something you didn't explain in bullet points or research papers. It had been choice. Still, the attention brought pressure. The shelter called next, not the local one. This time it was a larger facility in Flagstaff. They had space, they said. They could take all 6, pair them with nursing queens, or move them through a foster system. They'd be adopted quickly, most likely, given the story. "We can even note on their files that they were the falcon kittens," the woman on the phone said with a small laugh, as if that label somehow softened the idea of them leaving. I told her I'd think about it, and she was polite, but I could hear in her voice the expectation that I'd eventually fold, that I'd see reason. But the thing was, I didn't know what reason looked like anymore. That night, for the first time, I let them out of the crate, just for a little while. I sat on the floor with my back against the old couch and watched them tumble across the rug, chasing each other, swatting at dust motes in the glow of the lamp. Luna climbed my leg and curled into the crook of my arm like she'd always belonged there. For a moment, the house didn't feel like a halfway point or a holding pen. It felt like home. But then the power flickered and a truck passed slow outside, tires crackling on gravel, headlights sweeping across the window like searchlights, and I remembered we weren't invisible anymore. We were part of a story now, one that belonged to more people than I'd ever intended, and the weight of that realization settled on me as the kittens slept against my chest, 6 small heartbeats pressed into one quiet question. How do you give away something that started to feel like your own blood? The call that finally broke something open came just after sunset, when the sky was slipping from copper into bruised violet, and the air still held onto that desert chill that creeps in once the sun lets go. I had just finished feeding Bean, who now insisted on standing in my hand like a statue while I held the bottle at the perfect angle, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I answered out of instinct, expecting more questions, more pressure, but it wasn't the shelter this time, or animal control. It was a producer. National. Morning show. She spoke in warm, syrupy tones, using phrases like uplifting content and human-animal bonding in a time of crisis, and told me they'd love to fly me and the kittens out for a segment, just a few minutes, filmed live, nothing invasive. America could really use this story right now, she said, like I was doing the country a favor by existing. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no either. I just stood in the middle of the living room, the phone still warm in my hand, and looked down at the crate where the kittens had collapsed in a tangled pile of sleep. The idea of them being passed from one studio to another, their story told through edited sound bites and bright lights, made something clench inside me. They'd be admired, sure, talked about, cooed over, turned into GIFs and hashtags, but the real part, the part that mattered, would be lost. No one would know about Midge, about Brenda standing on the porch like a ghost, about the way Leena had looked at me that first night, as if we were the only 2 creatures in the world who understood what it meant to guard something you didn't know how to keep alive. I told Marla about the call the next morning while we stood outside, sipping coffee from mismatched mugs, watching the kittens chase each other around a stack of folded towels like they were training for a sport only they understood. She didn't tell me what to do. She just nodded slowly, eyes following Pumpkin as he skidded across the floor and crashed into Luna with a surprised squeak. "You're going to have to choose," she said after a long silence, her voice low and certain. "Whether they stay or go. Whether you want to be part of the noise or part of their quiet." That night, I sat with the kittens sprawled across my lap, every one of them warm and twitching in their sleep, and I imagined packing them into travel carriers, each one marked for a new destination. New families, clean slates. I imagined them without me. I tried, I really did, but my chest tightened until I had to stand, until I had to step outside just to breathe. And out there, in the crisp dark, I caught it again. The sharp cry cutting through the silence, distant but unmistakable. I turned toward the old radio tower, and for the first time in nearly a week, I saw her. Leena, perched on the highest rail, silhouetted against the moon, wings tucked close to her body like a secret she wasn't quite ready to share. It didn't take long for the return of Leena to stir everything back into motion. Word spread fast, probably thanks to Marla posting a blurry photo from her old Nikon that caught the falcon in mid-landing on the tower rail. The caption was simple, "She's back," but the reaction wasn't. People who'd moved on to the next news cycle came rushing back. Moreno showed up that afternoon, boots crunching across the gravel with that same weary determination he wore when hauling a drunk out of a ditch. He didn't come to argue this time. He came with paperwork, foster transfers, transport approvals, health reports, everything lined up in neat little piles, waiting for a signature. "You can still be part of it," he said, sliding the folder onto my porch table like an offering. "They go to vetted homes, all of them, together, if we can manage it. You won't be forgotten in the process." But I didn't care about being remembered. I cared about whether Bean would still sleep belly up like he did after feeding, whether Luna would learn to trust new hands, whether Pumpkin would keep his bold little swagger or shrink into silence without the chaos of this home. Moreno must have seen the hesitation in my face because his tone shifted. "You love them, that's clear. But sometimes love means letting go. You kept them alive. Now you have to ask yourself if you're the one meant to give them everything else." I didn't respond. I just closed the folder without signing and told him I needed time. He gave a tight nod and left without another word, his truck kicking up a trail of dust that hung in the air like a held breath. Later, Marla came by again, more cautious than usual, setting down a small bag of kitten treats and a folded article from a rescue journal. She sat on the steps with me, neither of us talking for a long while. Finally, she said, "You know, I had a dog once. Found him after a car wreck outside Holbrook. Broken ribs, mange, the whole mess. Kept him for 4 years. Then someone came looking for him. Claimed him. Said he'd run off during a camping trip. I gave him back." She looked down, thumb tracing the seam of her coffee mug. "Sometimes I still wake up thinking I hear him at the door." I didn't ask her if she regretted it. I didn't have to. That night, I moved the crate beside my bed. Not because they needed the proximity anymore. They were strong now, loud and tumbling and hungry on a schedule. I did it because I needed to hear them breathing. I needed the rhythm of them to drown out the noise building in my head. The interviews waiting for answers, the strangers wanting updates, the falcon watching from the tower like she was waiting for a choice only I could make. In the darkness, Echo climbed onto my chest and curled up, purring with a confidence he hadn't earned but wore proudly anyway. I closed my eyes and imagined all 6 of them in another house, in another town, without me. I couldn't see it clearly. I wasn't sure if that meant I wasn't ready or if I simply didn't want to be. By the 8th day, everything that had once been manageable, feeding schedules, news requests, even my own thoughts, began to crowd each other like animals in a too small cage. The kittens were thriving now, which made the decision even harder, not easier. There was no longer a question of survival. There was only the looming unknown of what came next. I watched them with a strange mix of pride and dread, knowing full well that every ounce of progress brought them one step closer to being adopted, divided, gone. Pumpkin now leaped across the crate like a lion in miniature. Scratch had developed an uncanny habit of staring directly into my eyes, as if trying to tell me something he hadn't quite learned the words for. And Luna, gentle, trembling Luna, no longer shied from touch but curled into it, like a leaf drawn toward the sun. Leena had taken to circling the property each morning now, not in her old stillness but in a sweeping, wide motion, as if surveying the ground she once claimed. Sometimes she vanished into the canyon for hours, but always, just before dusk, I'd hear her cry. Not frantic, not distant, but sharp and unmistakable, as if punctuating each day with a reminder that she was still watching, still waiting. That cry had become a kind of clock in my chest, marking the time I had left before I had to decide something I wasn't ready to admit had already been decided. The producer called again. This time, it wasn't just for the segment. She offered money. A small thank you, she called it. Enough to help me fix the back window, maybe replace the crate with something better, maybe cover a trip to the vet clinic in Chino Valley. "There's a real hunger for this story," she said. "People see hope in it. Unity, nature crossing its boundaries. It's beautiful, Dylan." But her voice, smooth and trained to sell comfort, rang hollow against the ache in my ribs. What she saw as a headline, I saw as weight. What she called beautiful, I carried like a secret. That evening, I sat outside with the kittens tumbling across the rug inside, the door open so I could still hear their little claws tapping against the wood. Marla joined me again, not with advice this time, but just presence. We sat in silence, each lost in our own private reckoning. Finally, she said, "There's a moment in every rescue when you stop being the bridge and start becoming the destination. It's not wrong. It's just heavier than people think." I wanted to believe I could be that destination, that my hands, my home, could hold 6 lives and not buckle beneath them. But in the distance, Leena circled again, her silhouette carved in twilight, and I realized something I hadn't let myself feel until now. She hadn't come back for them. She'd come back for me. She was waiting for my choice, not theirs. And with every beat of her wings across the evening sky, she was telling me one hard, steady truth. Whatever I decided, I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. It happened quietly, not in a burst of drama or under the scrutiny of flashing cameras, but on a still, golden morning when the light bent low through the trees, and even the wind seemed to pause. I woke before dawn, the house silent, except for the rhythmic breathing of 6 sleeping kittens, tucked into a warm nest of towels at the foot of my bed. I watched them for a long time, memorizing every twitch of their whiskers, the way their small bodies rose and fell like ocean waves against the tide of sleep. It struck me then, with a clarity I'd been resisting for days, that they weren't mine to keep. Not because I didn't love them, but because love wasn't the same as ownership. Love was heavier than that. Love meant protecting them, not just from danger, but from the limitations of a man who lived alone in a half-finished house with a falcon for a friend in a world that had suddenly grown far too big. I carried them out one by one, wrapped in soft fabric into the morning light. The travel crate sat open in the back of my truck, its door resting against the tailgate like an invitation or a warning. I still wasn't sure which. I wasn't taking them to Flagstaff or to a news studio. I was taking them to Marla's. She'd found a foster network up north, people who knew how to keep siblings together, people who weren't looking to flip them for attention or bend their story into something profitable. Quiet people, people like her, people like Leena. The ride over was quiet, save for the occasional soft rustle as the kittens shifted against one another, dreaming of nothing in particular. I kept one hand on the crate the entire way, as if my touch could reassure them, could make this part easier, when really it was for me. At Marla's, the transfer was gentle. No ceremony, no fanfare, just a few blankets, a clipboard, and the ache of letting go. I kissed each one on the forehead, Pumpkin first, then Luna, Scratch, Bean, Echo, and finally Toby, who hadn't even opened his eyes when I'd found him, and now blinked up at me with a sleepy, unknowing trust that nearly undid me. When it was done, I didn't linger. I didn't need to. I knew she'd care for them. I trusted her. But as I turned back toward the truck, I heard it again, that high, sharp cry slicing through the morning. I looked up, shielding my eyes, and there she was, Leena. Gliding low over the driveway, wings outstretched, casting a shadow that brushed across the top of my shoulders before she rose and vanished into the blue. Not circling, not watching, just passing through. And in that moment, I understood. Her part in this was done, and so was mine. The house feels emptier now, not just in the physical sense, the absence of small paws padding across the floor, the crate folded and tucked away in the corner, but in that quieter, deeper way that lingers in the margins of your day. I still catch myself pausing by the sink, listening for the soft mews that used to rise with the morning light. Sometimes I find myself reaching for bottles that aren't needed anymore, warming towels that no longer have kittens to swaddle. It's strange how quickly your life rearranges itself around new weight, how even after that weight is gone, you walk with a slight lean, like your body hasn't realized yet that it can stand up straight again. Marla sends updates, brief, thoughtful texts with photos attached. Pumpkin is already showing off to his new foster siblings. Luna curls around a toddler's feet like she's always belonged there. Scratch and Echo were adopted together by a retired couple with a garden big enough for exploration. Bean, it turns out, likes to sleep on typewriters, which his new owner collects in a sunroom lined with books. And Toby, little Toby, is still waiting, but he's safe, warm, growing. I look at those pictures more often than I'd like to admit. I tell myself I'm letting go, but I know some part of me is still gripping tight to the threads of their lives, as if watching from a distance can hold them close. Leena hasn't returned, not once, not even as a shadow in the sky. Part of me expected her to reappear, if only to acknowledge that what we started together had come to a close. But perhaps that's not how it works with wild things. Perhaps she was never really waiting for me to make a decision. Maybe she was only ever showing me the shape of one. There's a kind of wisdom in her disappearance, in the way she let herself be part of the story just long enough to change it, and then left it to unfold on its own. I try to carry that with me now, that restraint, that clarity. Some nights I sit out on the porch with a cup of coffee gone cold, watching the wind comb through the dry grass at the edge of the property. The sky turns dark, then darker, and I think about all the small lives that pass through ours without warning. How quickly they arrive, how quietly they leave. I wonder if rescue is really about saving others, or if it's about letting ourselves be changed by the act of trying. Maybe that's all we can ever do. Show up, hold on, let go, and trust that what we gave will echo out further than we'll ever see. If this story found you in the middle of something heavy, or in a moment where you're not sure what to do next, maybe this is your sign. You don't need to be ready. You just need to begin. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever rescued or said goodbye, or carried the weight of doing the right thing when it didn't feel easy, then you're already part of this journey. These aren't just stories about kittens or falcons or broken fences in forgotten towns. These are stories about us, about what we choose to carry and what we finally learn to release. So if this stayed with you, stay with me. Subscribe for more stories like this, real, raw, human. Hit the like button if you believe that compassion doesn't need to be loud to matter. And share this with someone who might need to hear that letting go isn't the same as giving up. Because the stories that matter most aren't always the ones we finish. They're the ones we live through together.